In the first and second days of training, you learned how to request data from the server to use in your application. In this video, you will learn how to send data to the server using the Flex HTTP service component. You will also handle the confirmation message from the server that returns the record ID for the data that was inserted into the database. In earlier videos, you retrieved data from the server and bound it for display to the employee drop-down list control of this company vehicle request form. In this exercise, you will send the data entered into this form to the server so that it can be inserted into the database. When I select an employee from the drop-down list control, this pre-fills the text input control for the employee's office phone number. I'm adding a mobile phone number, and then selecting the pickup and return dates from the date chooser controls. When I submit the form to the server, all of the data is sent. The server submits the data to the database, and then the record ID is returned to the Flex application, which displays it in this alert dialog box. This is the main application starter file. All this code should be familiar to you since you built it over the last 3 days of training. The HTTPService object retrieves the employee's data from a remote server and then loops over it to convert it from an array collection of generic objects into an array collection of value objects based on this employee's class in the value objects package. On each iteration of the loop, the employee instance is added to the employee's class property, which is bound to the employee's property of the vehicle request form custom component, which is the view in our MVC implementation. In this component, the data is bound to the drop-down list control. That is how data is coming into the custom component. Now let's review the data flow as it leaves the custom component in an event object to be handled by the main application. On the Form Submit button click, the handler instantiates the vehicle request class to create a value object that contains all the data from the form. This data is then passed as an argument into a custom event, which packages it into an event object. This vehicle request event object is handled back on the vehicle request form instance in the main application. I am control clicking on its registered event handler so that you can see the application currently just shows an alert message that the form was submitted. I've added a breakpoint to the closing curly brace of this handler, and now I am debugging the application. In the browser, I am filling out the form and then submitting it. The form data is dispatched from the custom component to the main application and then handled by the event handler that hits the breakpoint. When prompted, I am switching to the debug perspective and then drilling down into the event object to see the form data. Now that I have the form data in the main application, I can send it to the server. In the declarations block, I already have one HTTP service object. I am creating a second HTTP service instance to send the data back to the server. I'm giving it an ID property with a value of vehicle service, and then adding the URL property with a URL value that points to a Cold Fusion page that will accept the data. Remember that although we are using a Cold Fusion server for this training series, you can use any backend technology like Java, JSP, .NET, or PHP that can accept the data in an HTTP operation. The flex code is the same regardless of the backend technology. I am adding a method property and assigning a value of post. A post method will send the data in the message body instead of encoding it on the URL. Lastly, I'm adding the result event and using the FlashBuilder code assist tool to create the result handler. Most server-side processes usually define the type of parameters that they accept and the type of data that will be returned. There are two ways to send parameters on an HTTP service request: parameter binding and explicit parameter passing. In parameter binding, you can directly bind the values from UI controls or data models directly to the parameters. This method of sending data is only available if you have created the HTTP service object in MXML and not an ActionScript. The advantage of using this method is that you can apply validators to the parameter values before submitting them to the service. To implement this method, simply create a request property and pass one or more parameters as XML nodes. You then actually send the data to the server using the service object's send method. In this code, you can see the request property defined as a property of the HTTP service object. You can pass one or more values to the server by directly binding them in the XML nodes. Since this service is named employee service, you send the data to the server on some user or system event by referencing employeeservice.send. The second method for passing data in HTTP service calls is explicit parameter passing. You provide the parameters for the service in the service's send method as you would provide arguments to a function. The downside of this method is that you cannot use automatic flex data validation, which you will learn about later in this day of training. This first example passes the employee ID parameter with a value of 4 as a name-value data pair. Alternatively, you can first create an object and then pass the object in the send method as shown in this second example. This is the way I will send the data to the server for the company vehicle request form. In the custom event handler for this custom component, I am adding the vehicle service.send method. You just saw in the debugging session that the event object contains the vehicle request data object with all the form data. I am adding event.vehicle request data to the send method and then saving the file. I'm selecting the network monitor view and maximizing it so that I will be able to see the audit trail more clearly. I'm enabling the tool and then running the application. You can see that the first HTTP service call retrieves the data for display in the drop-down list control. I'm filling out the form. As I submit it, you can see that a second service request is made. When I look at the request tab, you can see that there's a parameters node. When I drill down into that, you can see that all the data is there to send to the server. On the response tab, I'm drilling down into the response body to see that the server is returning a vehicle data object that contains the vehicle request object. This object contains the ID property for the record that was inserted into the database. The add status property lets me know that the record was added successfully to the database. Back in the main application, I want to display an alert message with the record ID when the data is returned from the server. So in the result handler for the data, I am adding an if statement which evaluates whether event.result.vehicle request, vehicle data, dot vehicle request dot add status equals true. If it is, then I'm adding an alert.show method that states the request was submitted, the record ID is, and then concatenating the event.result.vehicle data.vehicle request.id. In the else statement, I am adding an alert.show method that states the request was not submitted successfully. I'm saving the file and then running the application and filling out the form. I'm going to put some string data into the mobile phone field and then select some dates. When I submit the form, I see that the server does not accept the data. However, when I correct that with a phone number, the record ID for the inserted data is successfully returned. For your next step, work through the exercise titled Passing Data to the Server with HTTP Service.